Me now, and let's try and just pull apart what we understand to be going on at the moment. Let's start with where we know everybody is. Zelensky here today in Abu Dhabi after the UAE President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed also met the Russian Deputy Prime Minister here over the last 24 hours or so. We also have Marco Rubio with the Russian Foreign Minister in Riyadh. So let's just pick apart what is going on at this point. How do you read these movements around this region?
Now, of course, all these movements are happening after the Munich Security Conference.
Which you were at?
I was at, and there was a real sense in Europe that they weren't part of the conversation. So Zelensky, of course, was in Munich, was speaking to his European allies and saying this is about European security, not only Ukrainian security. And yet the U.S. has made it very clear that the U.S. and Russia will try to come to a sort of deal. And they will bring in the Europeans at some point, and hopefully the Ukrainians. But it comes at a point when Europe is out of the picture because it's seen as party to the conflict. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, are not only neutral, but are vested in trying to solve this crisis and to end the war in Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine has a direct impact on this region, from food imports and wheat imports to, of course, the security of Europe is an extension to here in the Middle East. And also the dysfunction in the UN Security Council with the US and Russia at each other's throats for the last 3 years or so has to come to an end. So actually, it's in the interests of the UAE and Saudi Arabia to find a solution, but it's also positioning these two important strategic Gulf countries, Arab countries, to resolve problems in a way that includes this new American administration that is looking for different allies, because at the moment there's quite a bit of tension with Europe.
And you've just described very eloquently why it is very specifically on this Russia-Ukraine conflict, why it is that the UAE and Saudi Arabia are so visibly involved at present. Let's remind ourselves, these are two countries that have been mediating efforts for prisoner exchanges all the way through this conflict, of course. These are two countries that have retained relations with both Ukraine and Russia and have good relations with this Trump administration. There is also a wider sort of foreign policy of mediation that we are seeing sort of as a burgeoning effort, both here in the UAE, in Saudi, and indeed, of course, in Qatar. Let's focus on the Saudis, because that's where we see Marco Rubio, the foreign minister, effectively, of the United States, and an incoming trip by the Russian foreign minister, Lavrov. Very specifically, what do we know about the talks that are going on in Saudi at present? As I understand it, these are talks about talks, as it were.
Right, exactly. It's putting in the parameters of what does this look like. It's important, as you said, that you've had the prisoner exchanges, which the UAE and Saudi Arabia have helped facilitate. That builds confidence.
Correct.
So, with all people who work on mediation, they talk about the importance of having the right interlocutors, building that trust, and knowing that if you call this particular official, they can deliver. And the Saudis and the Emiratis have proven that. If we look at Saudi Arabia, exactly as you said specifically, Saudi Arabia is hosting talks between the Russians and the Americans to say, this is what the parameters look like. Who do we invite to the table? But also that you're going to need time to get the Ukrainians aboard, and we can do that. And there is talk that Vladimir Zelensky will go to Saudi Arabia also, and he's been to Saudi Arabia previously. So that's quite important, that they also have the trust of the Ukrainians to bring them around the table eventually. I can't imagine there's going to be a sort of deal that the Russians and Americans cut without the involvement of the Ukrainians. And we've also heard from President Donald Trump saying we will involve the Ukrainians when the time is right.
Moments after his phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin, President Donald Trump indicated to reporters that he would like to see talks toward ending Russia's war in Ukraine start, quote, immediately. And to that end, we are learning that President Trump is dispatching 3 of his top lieutenants to Saudi Arabia for talks with senior-level Russian officials in the coming days. Now, according to 2 sources familiar with those plans, we are learning that Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, as well as Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, will travel to Saudi Arabia for those talks. Now, our colleague Matthew Chance has learned that the Kremlin has also begun assembling its own set of senior-level officials to participate in those negotiations. That includes top political, intelligence, and economic figures. Now, President Trump, for his part, has also indicated that depending on the progress of those talks, he too could meet in person in Saudi Arabia with Russian President Vladimir Putin. He said that that meeting could happen in the not too distant future. And he also indicated that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman could be part of those discussions. Of course, the Crown Prince has been a key interlocutor between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and Russia. Now, one party that won't be at the negotiating table, according to U.S. Special Envoy for Russia and Ukraine, General Keith Kellogg, is the Europeans. Kellogg did say, however, that the Ukrainians would have a seat at that negotiating table, though he declined to say when exactly that might take place. Now, Kellogg also indicated Sunday at the Munich Security Conference that Russia is going to have to make concessions. Take a look.
To me, there's going to have to be things like territorial concessions as well. Okay, some of it is unrealistic to expect where you'd want to go to, but it's territorial. It's subterritorial. It could be the engagement of refusing to use force, renouncement of the use of force into the future. From a political side, he's not going to downsize his military forces. Hopefully, get rid of. What we're going to try to do is basically force him into actions. What you want to do is force him to actions maybe he's uncomfortable with.
We are seeing President Trump dramatically reshape U.S. foreign policy as it comes to Russia and Ukraine, and also seek to rebuild some of those relations with Russian President Vladimir Putin. But certainly very critical talks in the days ahead we'll be watching quite closely. Betsy Klein, CNN, traveling with the president in West Palm Beach, Florida.
The Russians remain very optimistic as far as those talks are concerned that are set to take place in Saudi Arabia this coming week between Russia and the United States to try and hammer out an agreement to end the war in Ukraine. But the Russians seem to believe that, in general, relations between Russia and the United States could go into a new era and get a completely new dynamic. The spokesman for the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, on Sunday said that he believes in the future there is going to be dialogue between the United States and Russia rather than confrontation under the Trump administration, and that also the two administrations will be speaking about peace, as he put it, in the future. Dmitry Peskov also said that he believes that President Trump's views on Russia should be endorsed by every sound-minded person, as he put it. So clearly, the Russians certainly putting a lot of stake into President Trump and what he's done so far in trying to get U.S.-Russian relations back on track. Now, the Russians, though, have made no secret of the fact that they believe that negotiations to end the war in Ukraine certainly won't be easy. They have said that they don't want to negotiate, for instance, about that pocket that the Ukrainians control on Russian territory in the Kursk region. They say they want to take that territory back. And then, of course, there is the question of all the territory that the Russians currently occupy on the Ukrainian side of the border. At the same time, the Russians also, after a phone call between Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on Saturday, in a readout, seemed to indicate that all of this could be a larger reset between these two nations. They said that the Secretary of State and the Russian Foreign Minister spoke not only about a possible agreement to end the war in Ukraine, but possible that there could also be talks about, for instance, sanctions relief and economic cooperation between the United States and Russia in the future. So clearly, there's a lot of dynamic right now here in political Moscow, and certainly a lot of optimism that Russia could be in a very good place with the United States fairly soon. Fred Pleitgen, CNN, Moscow.